Hey everyone, it's Movement Monday, which means we're just going to dissect into a little bit of detail a certain movement. And today, for our first one, I wanted to just discuss some things about squatting that you may not have thought about before. So, squats, as far as how people do them, they come in all different shapes, okay? So, what I mean by that is people's anthropometrics, or the length of their bones, are vary in their length and their size and their angles. So that means a squat that I do might look very different than a squat that you do, relative to how tall I am, how long my femur is relative to my torso. Different things like that can affect the shape of what your squat looks like. So that's why I always think that it's important to make sure that everybody understands that movement patterns are going to look different, and the way that a coach thinks a movement should look like can really limit their ability to help somebody, because if you think that a movement should look one particular way, you are going to find yourself very frustrated all the time, because it's quite rare for an individual to move in the optimal way. So, I think it's important for coaches not to throw the baby out with the bathwater as far as what a movement should look like. So again, squats are all going to look pretty different across the board. I've seen everything. There's great squats, there's not so good squats, and of course all the stuff in the middle. So all that said, there are some points of performance, if you want, of the squatting pattern that should essentially be consistent regardless of what the squat actually looks like. So, of course, by squat we're talking about basically going from a standing position to lowering your hips pretty much as far down as you can while still maintaining a couple of different points of performance. So number one, and most importantly, is the position of your spine. And by your spine, we're talking about your back, or the position of your back when you're moving through this movement. As you can see, my back is relatively flat, straight up and down. I want to avoid any rounding out, okay? You can see that the spine went from flat to kind of round, particularly at the bottom and the middle. And it's very important that you can keep that spine as flat as possible, because obviously with a rounded back, if we're under any load, that can cause some problems down the line. So how this relates to my first point about squats looking different, I don't care if your squat is perfectly upright, which I can't do, or if your squat looks more like this, based upon different things that I discussed before. Whether it looks like this or like this, you just have to make sure you're not rounded and you're not rounded. I don't really care what the position necessarily is of that spine relative to the floor, as long as the back stays straight, regardless of what it looks like, okay? So that's an example if we have two different looking squats, but they both have a flat back. So flat back is kind of the point on that. Another great point that we want across the board with whatever your squat looks like is making sure that the knees stay tracked over the shoes. I'm going to give you kind of a grotesque sort of view of this. Basically, if I were to draw a line straight from my knee down to my toe, that line would kind of intersect at perhaps the second toe. Okay, so big toe, second toe, right here. Okay, so I really want to make sure that my knee does not move inward from that location or too far out from that location. Okay, so the knee is a hinge joint, which basically means it's only going to flex and extend. It does not want to move side to side. It just needs to go like this. Okay, so any movement that deviates from sort of just flexion and extension is probably going to be an issue. So when we do our squat, again, we only want this joint to flex and extend, not adduct, abduct like that, okay? So basically what we're looking there is to make sure that it stays on path, okay? And that it doesn't move away from that position. So again, just to kind of demonstrate those two different kinds of squats, whether I look like this or like this, I got to make sure my knees don't do this in either of those kinds of squats. And there's more than those two different kinds of squats, but you get the picture. So a third point that I have here is that basically you want to make sure that your weight is located kind of in the midfoot back to the heel. The reason we want to do that is that if we go up on our toes like this, and this is just kind of an exaggerated position, if I squat like this, which actually there are some training variations in squatting where you would do that, but few and far between. We don't want to do that because it causes kind of undeserved pressure on the knee joint. Okay, so squatting is good for your knees despite what anybody might have told you. If you have knee pathology, yes, of course, we might not want to squat, but that's different. If you have healthy knees, squatting can make them even healthier. But there is something to be said about putting too much pressure on the front of the foot, lifting the heel, and it puts a little bit too much pressure on the knee joint. Okay, so regardless of what kind of squat you have, you do want the weight kind of distributed between the heel and the midfoot. Number 4 is basically the range of motion of the squat. So essentially, we would like to have a squat that brings our hips kind of as low as we can, again, without the hips the back rounding out. Ideally, my hip joint will travel below my knee joint. That said, as it relates to point number 1 about keeping the straight spine, if I go too low, it's very possible that I could round out. And there's a number of different things that can cause that. Point is, the lower you go, the higher the risk is for that back to round out. So we have to be very careful. We do want to train a squat that has, pretty full range of motion with the hips, okay? Because your muscles, tendons, and joints will only get stronger if you train at that range of motion. I mean, they'll get stronger at the other ranges of motion too, but you don't want to miss out on a nice full depth, full knee flexion, full hip flexion. But we do want to do not want to have low back flexion, right? So the back is always want to be flat, but of course we want to take advantage of the fact that a squat is such a great movement because of its full range of motion in the ankles, the knees, the hips. The core is staying strong to reduce any movement in the spine. Just an all-around great movement. So those 4 things are kind of the salient points that we want to see that are similar across the board with all the different kinds of squats. So whether you have a squat where your chest tends to go forward, that's okay. Or if you have a squat that's just perfectly upright, and all the other things in between, we want to see that those points of performance that I just mentioned are pretty much all sustained throughout the movement. Now, if you do have some low back pathology or you experience some low back pain maybe after squatting and things like that, you'll definitely want to let me know or let a professional know, somebody who specializes in joint mechanics and is a movement specialist. But as a coach, something that we do is make sure that you're not training through any pain. Now, squatting can have some shear forcing on the spine or cause some discomfort in that area if there's pathology present there, if there's some dysfunction in the spine. So if that's the case, we can train around that, and primarily we do it by utilizing single leg exercises rather than double leg exercises. The double leg exercises are going to be a little bit harder on the spine if you have pathology already. Single leg exercises will reduce that risk a lot more. So just another reason why it's really important that your coach, which is me of course, understands any kind of issues that you have regarding your back and knows what your squatting mechanics look like so that the prescription within your training regimen can be appropriate for you. So just to recap, we've got all different kinds of squats. Make sure that you're taking people's advice with a grain of salt as far as, hey man, here's what you should do with your squat, because they have an idea of what they think a perfect squat should look like. But that can do a lot more harm than good. Again, the feet placement of your squat, the location of your spine relative to the floor, those things can really be very different depending on how your body is shaped and how it was developed and what your patterns are throughout your day, how long do you sit, whatever. Just make sure that whoever is giving you this advice understands, of course, that you're an individual, and your squat's not going to look exactly like everybody else's squat. So that's important too. But then again, of course, you want to make sure that the back is flat, that the knees track over the toes, making sure that the weight is distributed between the heel and the forefoot. And of course, making sure that if you can train it safely, that the hips get all the way down past the knees. That's all I have today for Movement Monday. Hope you enjoyed. And if you have any questions about your squatting or you're unsure about anything regarding that movement, let me know.